April the 4th, 1968. At 6 p.m, the minister stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. He was only 39, yet he had accumulated many decades worth of struggles, triumphs, and setbacks. The civil rights leader had spurred landmark victories against segregation and racial discrimination in the United States. There was so much more for him to accomplish, but at 6:01 p.m, a snapping sound cracked loud in the Memphis sky. A bullet flew across the road, and Martin Luther King Jr. fell to the ground, bleeding from his head and neck. Almost 4 decades before the rifle was fired, Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia. The second of 3 siblings, he looked on in admiration at his minister father as he fought racial segregation still rife in the southern states. King Sr. was a member of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, and had won a campaign on equal pay for white and black teachers in America. By his late teens, Martin had decided that social action was his true calling, and that religion would be the means to that end. His decision had been influenced by his father, but also by the essay Civil Disobedience by Henry David Thoreau. Its basic principle is that a citizen's first obligation is to do what they believe is right, and not to follow the laws dictated by a majority or an unjust government. So, in September of 1948, Martin enrolled at Crozer Seminary. He excelled there, becoming the first African-American student body president. He read voraciously on theology and philosophy. Of note were his studies on Walter Rauschenbusch and his notion of a church responsible for social justice, but especially on Karl Marx. King appreciated Marx's critique of unbridled capitalism, but he never embraced communism due to its atheistic views. In 1951, King Jr. graduated from Crozer and continued his education at Boston University. While pursuing a PhD, he conducted with equal determination the courtship of a young student at the New England Conservatory, Miss Coretta Scott. He won over her initial reluctance about dating a minister, and the two were married on the 18th of June 1953. Dr. King was soon offered a post as minister at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. On December 1st, 1955, a black seamstress refused to give up her seat to a white passenger on one of Montgomery's segregated buses. Her name was Rosa Parks, and we've actually done a Biographics video all about her before, so check it out after this one if you fancy it. The white bus driver had Mrs. Parks arrested, prompting the reaction of the NAACP and the Women's Political Council. They organized a boycott of Montgomery bus services supported by nearly 20,000 African-American citizens. King initially offered nothing more than the basement of his church as a meeting place for the activists, but eventually he was offered the chance to lead their group, a chance which he accepted. King, an ardent fan of Mahatma Gandhi, stressed the importance of non-violent protest. The minister led the boycott for most of 1956, becoming the target of threats and violence by white citizens and the police. The protest ended on December 21st, 1956, when the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on buses was unconstitutional. But attacks from the white community did not stop. Homes and churches were bombed or shot at. Dr. King had scored an initial success, but a hard struggle still lay ahead. In January of 1957, King and other leaders of the boycott gathered in Atlanta, Georgia, and founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC, with the aim of coordinating civil rights protests. King became president and fundraiser of the conference, traveling across the nation and attracting crowds with his charisma and natural oratory skills. In one of his first recorded speeches, King outlined his concept of love as a force for change to fight an unjust system, saying, "Love is not merely an emotional something. Love is the refusal to defeat any individual. You seek only to defeat evil systems. Individuals who happen to be caught up in that system, you love, but you seek to defeat the system." King was encouraged and supported by a trio of advisors with hard-left inclinations. Bayard Rustin, an activist with communist sympathies, socialist Ella Baker, and Stanley Levison, a former leading member of the US Communist Party. In February 1957, King and his advisor sent a message to President Eisenhower requesting that he chaired a conference on civil rights. Ike ignored the letter, but Time magazine didn't, and they featured Dr. King on its cover. In May, King spoke to almost 40,000 people at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. Later in the year, he launched the Crusade for Citizenship, a program to register 2 million black voters in time for the 1960 presidential election. His caucus was growing mightily. In 1958, the Reverend published Stride Toward Freedom, his account of the Montgomery bus boycott. The book sold well, and he attended many book-signing events. At one of them in Harlem on September the 20th, 1958, Dr. King was stabbed by Isola Curry, later diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. The attacker used a letter opener, which slid very close to the minister's heart and one of his lungs. As he later recalls, had he sneezed in that moment, he would have surely died. Luckily, surgeons at Harlem Hospital were able to remove the blade without causing further damage. While convalescing, King took the occasion to travel to India in February 1959, where he deepened his knowledge of non-violent protest at the Gandhi Peace Foundation. Upon returning, King had occasion to test these tactics. In April of 1959, African-American college students in North Carolina staged peaceful sit-ins in diners to protest segregation. The SCLC had become involved with Ella Baker, who organized the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, in Raleigh, North Carolina. When the protest spread to Georgia, King participated in a sit-in in an Atlanta department store and was briefly jailed. Luckily, he was released early from prison thanks to presidential candidate John F. Kennedy. Kennedy sympathized with the civil rights movement, but was also trying to appeal to white moderate Southerners. This led the SNCC to distrust King. If he could appeal to Kennedy and his white moderates, how could he possibly be the best representative for them? King's devotion to the civil rights cause would be questioned again in the summer of 1961. The organization, called CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, had organized a series of freedom rides, or interstate bus trips intended to desegregate stations. King helped CORE by training freedom riders in the methods of nonviolent protest, but when they were met with violence by white counter-protesters, the minister questioned whether the campaign was worth all this pain. King's reticence attracted more suspicion and criticism. King's involvement, however, was supremely beneficial to the cause. Through his dialogue with Attorney General Robert Kennedy, he brought the federal government to his side. Robert Kennedy ensured federal agencies intervened to protect CORE protesters and ordered a ban on segregation in interstate travel. In December 1961, King joined another existing action, the Albany movement in Georgia. This was another campaign of sit-ins led by the SNCC. After many of its members had been incarcerated, King decided to step in. He and activist Ralph Abernathy were also jailed, but they kept campaigning until July 1962. Meanwhile, young protesters grew tired and frustrated until violence broke out. A crowd of 2,000 confronted the police despite King trying to maintain peace with a prayer vigil. City authorities eventually obtained a federal injunction which banned King and the SNCC from staging any type of protest. Until then, King had fought local authorities with the help of the federal government. Now that the federal government was being used against him, what were his chances? Even Bobby Kennedy advised him not to try his luck against the injunction. Martin Luther King left Albany in August. It had been a defeat, but he would learn from his mistakes for his next campaign in Birmingham, Alabama. In Birmingham, the state governor, the city mayor, and the chief of police were all known segregationists. Between 1957 and 1962, 17 bombings had taken place against black households and churches. One of them was the church belonging to SCLC member Reverend Shuttleworth, who invited King to take action in Birmingham. His campaign started on April 3, 1963, with lunch counter sit-ins that were followed by a march on City Hall. Again, nonviolent protests were followed by mass arrests and an injunction against the SCLC campaigns. But now the injunction came from a state court, not a federal one, and King had no qualms in violating state law. King and Ralph Abernathy led another rally on April 12th. The police cracked down, which eventually led to the two leaders being placed in solitary confinement. While in prison, King wrote his famous Letter from a Birmingham Jail, which became something of a manifesto for his movement. In it, he called for Christians to become a force for change, even at the price of being treated as agitators or disturbers of the peace. The church was not supposed to fit into the society around it, but to transform it by standing against injustice. In the meantime, Dr. King's wife Coretta had contacted the White House. Bobby Kennedy stepped in, sending FBI agents to Birmingham to ensure better treatment for the minister. He was soon released from jail, and more marches followed, met by increasingly violent actions by the police chief, who resorted to fire hoses and attacked dogs. The televised images of the Birmingham riot struck a chord with the conscience of the nation. It was a turning point for the civil rights movement, which prompted thousands of citizens to express their outrage to the White House. It became evident at the Kennedys that it was time to tackle racial issues more seriously. Obviously, with the tide of the nation turning against them, Birmingham City Hall signaled its willingness to negotiate a desegregation program. It was a great victory for Dr. King, albeit a bitter one. In a common pattern, concessions to African Americans were followed by violence from white citizens who were met with retaliation from the black community. True to his principles, King patrolled the streets of Birmingham, preaching African Americans to answer violence only with peace. A natural follow-up to Birmingham was the organization of a nationwide event. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom would take place on August 28, 1963. Tens of thousands of people would march to the Lincoln Memorial, where they would listen to speeches by Dr. King and other orators. The planning of the event proved controversial from the start. The Kennedy administration, supportive of King's strife, had agreed to submit a civil rights bill before Congress, a landmark moment, and yet both JFK and Bobby feared that if the march degenerated into rioting, Congress could reject the bill. So the administration participated in the planning, editing speeches, and including white organizations in the roster of participants. This move alienated other black leaders such as Malcolm X from the Nation of Islam, who questioned the authenticity of the march. The march organizers themselves were worried that the SCLC had appointed Bayard Rustin as chief planner. In fact, the FBI held a big dossier on him as a known communist, draft dodger, and homosexual. But despite internal concerns, the March for Jobs and Freedom was a success. Attendance exceeded expectations, and a crowd of 250,000 listened to Martin Luther King Jr.'s most famous speech.
I have a dream. My four little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight.
And he warned about not turning that dream into a nightmare of hatred.
We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protests to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force.
King and the SCLC had gone from strength to strength, but their victories would be soured by the opposition of one of the most powerful men in America, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. The director of the FBI had long feared that the civil rights movement may be infiltrated by communism. The Bureau had a dossier about Rustin, but their chief worry came from lawyer Stanley Levison, one of King's top advisors. Since the mid-1950s, the FBI kept tabs on Levison via its network of informants, including two members of the Communist Party named Jack and Morris Childs. The Childs reported that Levison had been a top financier for the party until early 1957 before growing disillusioned with communism. Then in January 1962, Jack Childs learned that Levison had been writing speeches for Dr. King. Days later, Bobby Kennedy received notice from Hoover that Levison was a member of the Communist Party USA and was allegedly a close advisor to Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Robert Kennedy authorized the bugging of Levison's office. Privately, he wanted King to sever ties with him. All the while, J. Edgar Hoover suspected that King was a communist too, and indeed, King had been sounded out by the Soviets. According to disclosures by ex-KGB archivist Vasily Mitrokhin, Moscow had taken an interest in infiltrating the civil rights movement, but had found that King was too pro-American and anti-communist to consider any sort of relationship with the Soviets. Subsequently, the KGB launched a disinformation campaign in African newspapers depicting King as a government pawn. Regardless, Hoover's suspicion grew into personal dislike until late 1962, when King criticized the Bureau's investigation of racial crimes in Albany. According to a Department of Justice report, this is when the flames of Director Hoover's antipathy for Dr. King were fanned into open hostility. We believe the persistent controversy between Dr. King and Director Hoover was a major factor in the Bureau's determination to discredit Dr. King and destroy his leadership role. This hostility may explain what happened in March of 1963. Jack Childs informed the FBI that Levison had severed all ties with the party, but Hoover failed to notify the Attorney General. So in June of 1963, Bobby Kennedy increased his pressure on King. The minister had to get rid of Levison. King reluctantly agreed, but he and Levison remained in touch, using attorney Clarence B. Jones as a telephonic intermediary. The FBI picked up on the ruse and wiretapped Jones's home and office. In August of 1963, King stayed at Jones's place, and Hoover's bugs recorded something unexpected, proof of an extramarital affair that King was involved in. Then, in October of 1963, Robert Kennedy extended permission to conduct technical surveillance on King. The investigation was led by FBI Assistant Director William C. Sullivan, who focused on documenting the minister's private activities and sex life. But Sullivan did not just record King's encounters on tape. In 1975, FBI Supervisor Seymour Fred Phillips testified before the U.S. Senate that Sullivan had used one of these tapes to blackmail Reverend King. He had sent him a copy of a recording alongside an anonymous letter threatening to expose the truth to Coretta and the public. The message included a veiled invitation for the minister to commit suicide lest the information be leaked. King ignored the threats, obviously, and the FBI did not go public with the scandal. But the Hoover-King feud continued throughout 1964. King accused Hoover of abetting racists and right-wingers. Hoover retorted by calling him the most notorious liar in the country and a sexual degenerate. FBI agents continued to monitor the civil rights leader, but most surveillance was dropped in 1965. This is when the Kings moved into a new house in Atlanta. Apparently for administrative reasons, Hoover wanted to cut down on his astronomical number of wiretaps, so he did not authorize the bugging of King's new place. The FBI tapes will be fully disclosed in 2027, but some of the transcripts and surveillance notes were declassified in June of 2019. The dossier reveals how King engaged in several extramarital affairs with fellow activists, parishioners, and sex workers. FBI agents even suspected he may have fathered a child out of wedlock. Page 18 of the report contains a disturbing comment. On January 5, 1964, King and other SCLC officials checked into a hotel in Washington, D.C. The group met in the room of a Baltimore minister and started discussing which of their parishioners would be suitable for natural and unnatural sex acts. When one of the women in the group protested her disapproval, the Baltimore minister immediately and forcibly raped her. A handwritten note, possibly by Sullivan, comments that King looked on, laughed, and offered advice. So, could that be true? David J. Garrow, the Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer of King, was the first to review the documents in a lengthy essay, commenting that we will know the full truth only when the actual tapes are revealed. Let's return to King's public life, as we have reached the pinnacle of his career. In 1964, King offered his support to Lyndon Johnson's electoral campaign. Following the assassination of JFK, Johnson had vowed to support the Civil Rights Bill. And on July 2nd, Johnson invited King to the White House for a signing of the Civil Rights Act into law. This was the crowning achievement of King's efforts in Montgomery and Birmingham, a law which prohibited discrimination in public places, provided for the integration of schools and other facilities, and made workplace discrimination illegal. In October of that same year, the Reverend received a phone call from Oslo. He'd won the Nobel Peace Prize. He collected the award on December 10th, donating the prize money to the civil rights movement. Shortly after his return, another trial awaited him in Selma, Alabama. This is where the black population had been actively prevented from registering to vote by a segregationist mayor and police chief. On February 1st, King led a march to the Selma courthouse to protest slow voter registration. Inevitably, he was jailed for 5 days. A second march took place on the 18th, but protesters were attacked by a white mob. A young black man was shot and died of his wounds. King knew that he had to involve the president at this stage, so on March 5th he met with Johnson and encouraged him to introduce a voting rights bill. The aim was to outlaw stalling tactics and intimidation used to prevent African Americans from vote registering. But Johnson declined, so King unveiled his next plan, a massive march from Selma to Montgomery. On March 7th, more than 500 people began marching up the highway to Montgomery. When they reached the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were confronted by state police. At least 66 protesters were badly injured in the riots, but televised images of the battle inspired similar protests in major cities nationwide. Johnson was now paying full attention to this struggle. King made his next move, a second and larger march. Again, demonstrators met with police on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, but this time King ordered the march to disperse despite the protests of fellow activists. That night, back in Selma, a white minister from Boston who had participated in the march was murdered by Klansmen. The Selma case exploded and thousands of religious leaders picketed the White House. President Johnson was now convinced that he needed to support Martin Luther King in this struggle. On March the 24th, he ordered 4,000 troops to escort a third and successful march to Montgomery. Another big victory for King and the SCLC, soured again by another killing. A white activist was shot later that night. Nonetheless, the events of Selma prompted Johnson to draft the Voting Rights Bill, which was signed into law on August 6, 1965. Just 6 days later, King first spoke against Vietnam at an SCLC convention. King demanded that the government end its intervention in Vietnam and even offered to lead peace negotiations with the North Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh. Bayard Rustin discouraged him from tackling the issue, as the civil rights movement could not afford to alienate Johnson's support. Moreover, they could not disperse their energies into further causes or movements. For the moment, King agreed. His next campaign of note would focus on improving economic conditions for black communities in northern cities. He organized the Freedom Sunday in Chicago on July 10, 1966, and 45,000 people joined the peaceful event. But riots broke out in Chicago's west side between black youth and the National Guard. All in all, the experience did not yield the reforms that King had hoped for. It appeared that the more militant activists were rejecting his non-violent tactics. One of them, the head of the SNCC, Stokely Carmichael, parted ways with King and co-founded the Black Panther Party. In November of 1966, King resumed his criticism of the war. He testified to the Senate that military spending was taking precedence over the budget designed to improve the living conditions of urban black communities.
The bombs in Vietnam exploded home. They destroyed the dream and possibility for a decent America.
On February 25, 1967, King delivered his first public speech against the war, followed by an anti-war demonstration in March. Then, in April of 1967, his speech Beyond Vietnam made the news, but not in a positive way. King expressed his sympathies for the Viet Cong and called for US forces to leave Vietnam. Life magazine objected that the speech sounded like Viet Cong propaganda, and the Reverend was attacked by other civil rights groups. More importantly, the speech angered President Johnson and revived the FBI's efforts against King. The Bureau disseminated articles criticizing the Reverend and even hindered the SCLC fundraising efforts. King realized that he could not play a decisive role in the pacifist movement and that the domestic issues revolving around racism and poverty had to remain his primary focus. Late in 1967, King announced his plans for a Poor People's March on Washington on April 22, 1968. It was conceived as a huge rally of the poor with no racial limitations, intended to shut down the Capitol until proper reforms were made. But Martin Luther King Jr. had never lived to see it. In March of 1968, Reverend King joined a strike of black sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, who demanded equal pay. King joined a first march on the 28th, which soon turned violent. Not approving of these methods, King left Memphis, but returned a few days later on April 3rd. On that night, King delivered his last speech, "I've been to the mountaintop."
Like anybody, I would like to live a long life, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
"I may not get there," he said. And unfortunately, this line rang eerily prescient as the following afternoon, the bullet of an assassin ended Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. The shooter was a man named James Earl Ray. Following the shooting, riots erupted across the states, but the death of King also had the effect of coalescing his supporters into peaceful and meaningful protest. The Memphis strike and the Poor People's March on Washington were a success. During his lifetime, Reverend King had his critics both within and outside the civil rights movement. The militant factions dismissed his non-violent tactics and criticized his appeal to moderate whites, while law enforcement opposed him and sought to discredit him. And in the not-too-distant future, we'll find out the definitive truth about his private life and his misdeeds. But no one can deny the long-lasting effects of his major legacy, the culmination of the civil rights and Voting Rights Acts. More than any other leader of his time, King dared to dream. Even today, his life's work may yet remain incomplete, but for the betterment of all, his dreams have taken a concrete shape. So I really hope you found today's video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.